Hi there, welcome to Tig's Creations. In this video what I want to do is show you the procedures step by step that I use for making live edge river tabletops and river tables. I didn't tend to make live edge river tables, but I'd been making hardwood and epoxy resin charcuterie boards for some time, and some very close friends of mine asked me if I would make them a side table for their entryway to their holiday home in Hilton Head. And initially I said no, and then I thought, well, no, I can do this, and you know, they're good enough friends that they said that they would accommodate any small mistakes that I might make along the way. But I hope I've perfected the approach a little bit now. The finished article that I did for Pete and Laurie is up here, but what I'm going to show you today is the steps that I use to make up a live edge walnut river tabletop with a blue and green epoxy center. Without further ado, here we go. This is the final live edge resin river table that I'm going to show you how I made in the following video. I started off using a 1.5 inch thick black maple slab that I purchased from Peach State Lumber, which thankfully they'd surfaced a little bit before I started this project, which was a great help. I then used my Craig plunge cut circular saw and AccuGuide track system to roughly cut the slab in two. Having cut the pieces in two, I next moved each half outside, clamped them down, and used my angle grinder with a cut saw shaping disc to remove the bark on the outer edge. What I have found that with all of the best intentions and attention with the angle grinder, you can never really get rid of all of the nicks and crannies in the edge of the wood. What these tend to do then is act as sources for bubbles for air to be released during the course of the curing when you do the deep pour. And what I've found is that if you take some of the deep pour epoxy and dilute it by 50% with acetone, what you can do then is you can paint that onto the wood, and it cures up very quickly, so you're not being delayed by 3 days. It's usually overnight will do. And what it does is it stops the wood from degassing basically when you do the subsequent deep pour for the table. One thing that is absolutely essential in building river tables is that the base that you put your frame on and pour the epoxy onto is absolutely flat. If you don't do that, the epoxy is just going to pull down at the lowest point. Although I used a melamine board for the base of my mold, as you can see here, I covered the entire surface with Tyvek tape, because no matter what anybody tells you, epoxy resin can and does and will stick to melamine. So cover it with Tyvek and you won't have any problems releasing the epoxy base. I don't use anything particularly special for the for making the mold for the tabletop. I use cut down and flattened 2x4s for the sides. I use a Blanco White Lightning 3006 siliconized acrylic caulking sealant to put underneath the 2x4s and around the edge to seal everything in. Some wood screws to seal everything up, and as you'll see in a little while, I use some 90-degree angle clamps to make sure that the base is true with the wood insert. So I make the base to fit the wood rather than cut the wood down to fit the base. As you see here, I've got the angle clamp on. I'm just setting up the end piece, making sure that it's relatively tight with the wood. The wood's just in place to give me a size measurement. I clamp the wood down, and then I'll use some 2.5 inch wood screws to hold that in place, the silicone sealant on that end. And I just repeat this process going round obviously all 4 corners so everything's square, and then I put silicone sealant on the underside of the mold and clamp it down in place, as you see the clamps up in the top end of the picture there. And so everything's sealed in and ready to go and begin the pouring. Actually, that's not strictly true. The first thing that you've got to do is make sure that the wood is firmly held down, and these I just use some cross pieces and some more clamps to hold the wood firmly down. I put a little bead of cork across the edge to try and prevent overflow of the epoxy as I was pouring it, but as you'll see later, I didn't really have a problem here. I decided to do the pour for this tabletop in 2 stages. The primary reason is that with the first pour, that's when you usually find out whether or not you've got a leak in your system, and so rather than waste a whole load of epoxy, you only really waste the first bucketful. The second is that I wanted to do a sort of two-tone effect with the epoxy, so I had more green mica in the epoxy in the second mix than I did in the first, and I think you can see that the outer edges retain a slightly bluer hue than the center, which is sort of the effect that I was going for. After it's cured up, after 3 or 4 days, you just break down the mold and end up with your tabletop. If only it was as simple as that. What I didn't show you is me wrapping up the tabletop in cloth and driving it over to my good friend Kelly King over in Woodstock at the Woodland Steelworks for him to put it on his huge Avid CNC machine and plane both surfaces absolutely flat. So now comes part of the process that makers know only too well, but I don't think that customers necessarily appreciate, and that's how long it takes to get these tops feeling and looking exactly the way that a customer would like them to be. I routinely sand each side from 80 grit through to 320 grit and then wipe down with mineral oil to see what the end product's going to look like. I then chamfer each of the top sides with a 45-degree 1/4 inch chamfer. Next thing to do was mark out the positioning of the bracket holes for the legs that I was going to use on the tabletop. I chose to use hairpin legs for this project because the angle base to hold the legs in place would fit into the dimensions of the wood. I chose threaded metal inserts to anchor the legs of the table because I didn't think that the screws provided by the manufacturer were strong enough to bear the weight of the tabletop. I replaced the screws with 3/4 inch 1/4 bolts. One of the last things to do was to apply a finishing coat to the surface of the table, and for this I chose to use a Rubio monocoat finish and applied it in a thin coat until the entire surface was covered. Once the monocoat was applied to both the top and bottom surfaces, I attached the legs. So here's a quick view of the tabletop in the workshop, and now up in a more fitting place to display it. I think you can see from these shots it's come out really nicely. If you're interested in this board, I also have this and a sister board and a couple of other tops that are available for sale on my Etsy shop. While I'm on this subject, I should mention that the hairpin legs aren't the only option that are available. There are several other different styles that I've outlined a couple of here. The choice of leg style is up to the customer and is simply limited by the width of the tables that I make. I hope you've enjoyed watching the process by which I made this table and are interested in looking at maybe some of the items that I make in my shop here in Georgia. I've enjoyed showing this to you, and I'd be happy to custom make things for you if you had any interest. Take care for now, and I'll see you soon.